Sebastian Odeholm, lovely to meet you. Thank you very much for being involved in the project. Looking forward to chatting with you extensively about the subject of heavy music. What are your takes on heaviness, and do you feel it's restricted to the metal genre?
It's not restricted to the metal genre for sure. There's a lot of other genres kind of that are heavy, but for me it has a lot to do with the frequency spectrum and like the frequencies that the music produces, and like maybe like deeper bass that is maybe louder than a rock song or a blues song or whatever that's not heavy in comparison, or stuff like that. So like the production has a lot to do with it, for me at least.
And do you feel that there's obviously different forms that heaviness can take? There's, you know, different performance speeds is huge, going right back to Black Sabbath all the way through to Lorna Shore, and then levels of down tuning, and obviously with Humanity's Last Breath being, you know, significantly down tuning. What are your observations about what you as a listener perceive as really heavy? What is it to you that goes, that is super heavy?
I think it's the combination of groove or rhythm, and not groove necessarily, but the rhythm in combination with the tempo and, like I said, the frequencies that the music is producing. Like, and there's some, for me at least, there's like some frequencies in certain instruments that are not heavy compared to like other frequencies. So it's like super nerdy for me, but that's like the only way I can describe it. It's like the impact of the music hitting certain frequencies in a certain way makes stuff heavy to me.
And over the time that metal has existed as a genre, how do you feel that heaviness has changed over time, factoring in technology and performance changes?
Yeah, it's changed a lot, because now you hinge more on production than the music, but sometimes that can hinder music, but sometimes you can kind of, if you write music with that type of production and like this super detailed and super compressed sound, you can get new, unique forms of music. Instead of kind of making your not so heavy riff sound heavier with the production, you can actually use the production to go even further. And that's kind of what we see now with a lot of bands, and that's kind of what I try to do as well.
As far as taking heaviness further, as you say, where do you think it can go from here? Can heaviness continue to progress?
The thing for me that is lacking right now is the physical feel of, maybe like when you go to a concert, there's a physical feel of the music, like feeling it actually hitting your chest and feeling the impact of the sound, because it's actually an impact that's happening in the real world. If you could somehow transfer that to like music, that's the next level as far as I'm concerned. As far.
And in what form would it be? Because there's, you know, there's those jackets you can wear where you get like tactile transduction.
Right.
Would it be that?
Maybe that could be, but that it still has to be combined with the actual production, or the actual mix has to convey that sense of impact. And that's kind of like, you can only go so far with sounds and a stereo feel, or you need that tactile kind of real world feeling of like being at the place or whatever.
And do you think production can deliver that?
I mean, I hope so, or like at least come closer than we are now. Maybe that's the right way to say it. Yeah.
And do you see metal music developing without electric guitars?
I mean, I feel like electronic genres, maybe like dubstep or whatever, you can say that is metal without guitars already. But for me, for some reason, I need that band context still, because I like that, and that's what I'm used to, and that's kind of what you compare to all of the time, like, because you're used to hearing a band a certain way, like maybe like a rock band sounding a certain way, but then you take those same instruments and kind of go as far as you can with metal, and you compare to like a down-tuned guitar is not going to be down-tuned unless there's an up-tuned band or whatever. There has to be the difference between uptuned and downtuned, basically.
Yeah, sort of context.
Yeah, context. Yeah.
Do you think it can go any lower tuned, or do you think it can go any faster?
I mean, I feel like what's more relevant, like the reason you're tuning down is because you want to produce lower frequencies, and there might be other ways to do that than actually tuning down, and that might be what's the next step. Like that, tuning down doesn't necessarily have to be the only way to generate these super low frequencies. Yeah. But yeah, that's my take. Yeah.
When you listen to metal music, or you are exposed to it either from a production or recording perspective, what are the bands and the genres and the styles that you find are really exciting compared to metal music that's more cathartic and got a kind of that you respond to differently emotionally?
I feel like the new, like I'm just saying that because I'm part of it, but at the same time I'm part of it because I love it. So like all the fall type bands, which is like this new wave of like down-tuned technical music, I feel like they're combining the right elements. They have like the clean guitars with a lot of reverb that kind of has that emotion to it, and at the same time on top of that you have these super down-tuned, super ignorant, like almost like atonal guitars on top of that. So like you have these two things working with and against each other, and that kind of gives me the entire like emotional palette I want to hear at the same time, you know.
That's interesting. Something we'll come back to, because I think from listening to your production work, the depth dimension is very important to you. Certainly, you listen to Humanity's Last Breath, and there's a lot of reverb and long reverbs on the guitars that gives that reals. Have you listened much to Sleep Token?
I haven't. They're like one of the newer bands, and you know how it is. Like it's hard to get into newer music, and those guys are more like pop kind of, and I come from like death metal, and like I like the more extreme stuff.
Sure.
And to me, when you start making these pop choruses and stuff, I kind of lose interest really fast, because that's not why I do metal. I do metal because I'm not opposed to pop, but it's like it's kind of a rebellion somehow. Like you've grown up listening to conventional music all of your life, and then you hear metal is like, and the metal is like to all of the other music. So I kind of feel that way in some sense. Like I want to create like extreme stuff, basically. Yeah.
So for you, heaviness is also to do with nihilism and rebellion and darkness and
I feel like I like music in general that is that has that vibe. Yeah.
Fascinating. When you are listening to metal music, or whether when you're mixing metal music, what do you feel that the foundational components that deliver heaviness to the listener, or is it everything? I
feel this, like in the genre I'm operating in the most of the time, I feel like impact is the one. I actually named my studio Impact. I had to change it, but Impact Studios. But yeah, impact is for me, and like that's a very specific sort of impact, where everything is super nerdy, but like when everything is in phase with each other, and nothing is taking away from the other instrument, that everything is just like getting you can get that fist in your ear, basically, from everything just impacting at the same time.
But with everything impacting at the same time, when we then look at everything impacting at the same time with much faster subdivisions or much slower subdivisions, where you got so much more space for the bass frequencies, what are your observations there about how it impacts how we perceive heaviness?
Yeah, I feel like the slower stuff gives, I mean, impact and heaviness has a lot to do with the low ends. If you're doing slower music, it'll have more time for you to actually hear those low frequencies, and they can ring and stuff. If you play really fast, I feel like you're really losing heaviness, but it's not necessarily bad. It's just like, it's not heavier, it's just faster. And if you want to be faster, that's fine. But like, you have to control the low end to be able to have these really fast parts, of course. But if you're talking about being as heavy as possible, slower is definitely the way to go, I feel, at least.
So it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you start thinking there's energy that can then create heaviness as well, and that there's a huge amount of energy going on, but then you've got less of those low frequencies that we perceive
Right.
with heaviness.
Yeah.
And you listen to, like, I don't know, Behemoth's Evangeline album, there's so little low frequency content in. There's like very little below like 90 hertz, which is it's a really fascinating.
But it's like it's just the mix engineer having to do that to make the mix work, because it has to work when it's super. It can't really fall apart all of a sudden if they start to playing fast. So it's like it has to be that way. There are ways, of course, to maintain low frequencies and in faster tempos, but I don't feel. It's just like it's still going to be heavier if you're just doing it slower.
Sure.
I feel like it's at least.
And with the faster performances, what are your thoughts and observations on the way that technology is informing all of that? The beat detective, quantization, edits, and arguably creating performances that you could consider as hyperreal, or it's a lot tighter than in reality. What are your thoughts about that whole debate?
I feel like it's up to the band and the engineer always, and no one is forcing anyone to do anything. I've come this far because I deliver a product that people want, and that product happened to have this super tightly edited sound and these hyper realistic things in the mix, and that's what people expect from me, and that's also what I want to hear. And what that has to do with me growing up with like listening to bands that has a lot of triggered drums like Morbid Angel and Dimmu Borgir and stuff like that. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and that's what I want to hear. But at the same time, if you want to do a more organic and like loose tempo type song, I can do that as well. There just has to be a conversation about it. But what I hear from bands is never like, can we make this less tight? It's like and that also has to do with getting that impact I'm talking about. Then all the transient has to be at the same point, like as far as like the guitar, the bass, and kick drum has to hit exactly at the same time and be in phase, which is like samples of timing difference. So to get that impact, it has to be edited, basically.
Yeah. Moving on from that challenge about impact and aligning the transient so you get that impact, what would you say are the main challenges when mixing metal music, be it fast, be it slow, be it down-tuned, but mixing metal music compared to mixing other genres, the central challenges that you need to overcome?
Well, I'm mixing metal most of the time, so I don't know if I have a big like reference for like other genres that way. So I don't really know, maybe, but I feel like mixing metal is one of the most complex, if not the most complex genre, because of the aggressiveness and the loudness and fitting all these elements. It's always so many elements at the same time. And like a pop song is constructed in a way where you don't really have to mix, because they are producing the track so that the vocal is front and center and all the production is going to be around that. In metal, it's like everything at the same time, all the time. So that's kind of the main challenge. I was like, to get this clarity and to get everything heard, all the elements heard is hard. Yeah.
And would you say that's the central challenge with all of those textures and those dense tonalities and performances, is getting the clarity?
Yeah, I mean, getting everything heard, all the elements heard. That's basically it, yeah.
Outside of drums, bass, guitar and vocals, what textures have you worked with that significantly enhance our perception of heaviness?
I mean, just like sub synths, maybe sub frequencies, sub effects. That's like the low end, like maybe like sub drops or like effects like that can really add like that impact to maybe a start of a song or a start of a breakdown or whatever, where you can get that extra low end oomph into a part. That really helps for sure with the heaviness, yeah.
Sure. More on the technology side of things, and I'm aware that you like employing plugins like sound radixes auto-align to get that phase coherence. Where do you feel technology can go to solve some of these challenges that we're talking about, that can make music heavier or clearer or denser or more cohesive?
I feel like there's a way you can probably have tracks listen to each other. So let's say the guitars is listening to the bass and the drums and the vocals, and kind of doing active EQ moves to maybe let through some of the frequencies that are clashing. I mean, that could be like what's it called? A thing that DAWs can add as a feature that maybe can be called like separation. And if you click separation, the tracks will be listening to each other and make changes depending on what. Maybe the kick drum hit extra hard there, then the bass frequencies will duck a fast, and they can listen to each other. And in that way, everything will make space for each other, and at the same time, you can get more clarity. Yeah.
From that perspective, what are your thoughts on the way AI is able to deliver those qualities and moving forwards?
I don't have a lot of experience with AI and mixing at all. I feel like people are interested in the human, what's it called? Taste. Like the reason I am where I am is basically because of my taste, and the rest is like me just trying to get to a place where I can imply, or it's like get my taste on the music. Basically, I'm just like working all these techniques to just be able to make sure the music is to my taste, basically. So that's kind of the end goal. And I feel like without taste, it's hard to get anything unique that can resonate with another human. But at the same time, I don't know what's gonna fucking happen with AIs. It's scary, of course, but I mean, what can you do?
Absolutely. We talked about your love of death metal music, and talking about Dimmu Borgir you mentioned, and Morbid Angel. With some of the bands, and particularly Scandinavian bands, that have rejected what both of us consider high production standards and gone more towards lo-fi production standards, Dark Throne is just one example. Do you think those productions can be considered as heavy, or are high fidelity productions?
I don't know if it's heavy, but it's certainly good. I listen to like black metal that's like where the production is bad, but it's not bad. It's just like, I think it's totally aligned with the feeling they're trying to what's it called, convey. And I really like that stuff. I like all sorts of stuff that's not like high production. I listen to like hip hop where like I can hear that the palette is like, we're not gonna try hard to make this super perfect production, because that has a certain like feeling to it. It might sound more like what's it called? Sounds like they don't have any experience in production, but the feeling they're creating is what it's supposed to sound like, and it's all about the feeling. So like, I'm good at creating that heavy feeling, the really like good production, but there's other feelings you can create that might not necessarily be heavy, but it's still good, like black metal.
Yeah, and so it's like texture and atmosphere.
I would say, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. What album have you produced that you feel presented the most challenges, and how did it turn out production standard wise? Like, which was the most difficult project you were working on?
Probably some of the HLB stuff, like the latest HLB record, Ashen. I was just like trying to cram in as much low end as possible on all of the instruments, which is super hard when it's so down-tuned, and all the instruments are like fighting amongst each other in the same frequency range, which is hard to like get that clarity that we talked about. So it's like, that was super hard, and on top of that, having like sub heavy synths and other type of production that's also interfering. So I had to come up with a bunch of techniques to kind of make a low end hierarchy somehow. So like kick is like that's gonna be number one, and maybe bass is number two, and guitar is number three, and blah blah blah. So it's like there's a hierarchy to that where all of the low end instruments kind of interact in a way to get that clarity. But it was really hard to make that happen for sure.
When you said a hierarchy there,
Yeah.
did you have a hierarchy of frequency ranges within the sort of like sub 120 hertz region where you were trying to put them into different brackets?
No,
or?
I feel like my way of working is like I make the instrument sound the way I want it by itself. And then when I combine everything, I kind of hear what problems might occur. And then I try to work around that and try to maintain the tone or the drum sound or whatever that I made that I thought sounded good by itself. I try to maintain that as much as possible to not compromise. But you have to compromise, of course, because when you're introducing all the other instruments, it's going to be clashes and it's going to be hard to make it all work. Yeah.
And conversely, albums that presented the least challenges, and how did they turn out?
I feel like the least challenges is like is when the instruments are tuned regularly, because they're designed to occupy a certain frequency range, and everything just kind of falls into place automatically when it's not down tuned. So that's kind of like the more easy stuff. When it's just maybe like drop C and up, everything just kind of falls into place because it's already occupying the frequency ranges that it's meant to occupy. So that's like, it's just easier.
That's interesting. Do you feel that metal albums can be overproduced?
Yeah, all of mine are. I mean, it is what it is. Like, it's just a sound, and people want that sound, which is great for me because that's the sound I'm doing. So like, but I can totally agree. I mean, if you're like the amount of detail I put into all of the instruments and I maximize every detail on every level, that is the definition of overproducing, I think. But it's like I've said this before, but I'm over the sound of like a band, a guitar, bass, drums, vocals. That's boring. I want to maximize everything to make it sound new, or make it sound different, or like make it compete with maybe electronic styles that has that full frequency range, sound huge. You know, I want the band sound to be that huge as well. Yeah.
And along the way to answering that, what would you say are I know it's a really difficult question, but what would you say the heaviest albums you've produced and the heaviest albums you've not produced? That's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, me and my buddy Kalle from Vildhjarta, we always say that the heaviest album ever is Everywhere at the End of Time by The Caretaker. But that is like a 6.5 hour art project, which is like deteriorating music that is meant to portray dementia, but it does it in such a horrible and real way that you really like feel bad, and it's so, but that's heavy emotionally, but it's like it really affects you after you listen to it. It's like you really get that sense of losing your contact with the world, basically. And that's like, we always say that that's so heavy, I don't want to listen to it. I don't want to hear it because I don't feel good when I listen to it.
That's interesting. Emotionally heavy.
Yeah.
It's kind of like subject matter. Would you pick up on those emotions if you didn't know what the
context were? Yeah, I think I don't know. I would probably get some sort of like eerie feeling from it, but like reading about it first, of course, kind of puts you in that context. But it also helps you appreciate it fully, I feel.
Interesting.
But yeah, the heaviest album I've worked on, that's also hard. I mean, since I'm in a band that's trying to be as heavy as possible, and that's like, I put all my cards on that. Like, I put everything into making HL be as heavy as possible. So that's just has to be it, because that's like the one thing I'm trying to do with HLB. So like, it has to be that.
Sort of moving towards thinking about mixing, but staying with the broad concepts. What do you feel, you were talking before about, which was fascinating, that you get the instruments, the drums, the bass, the guitars to sound as you want them to in isolation, in solo, and then take it into the context of the mix and see what are the trade-offs. What do you feel are the trade-offs and limitations when you're looking at that? In other words, with greater guitar density, the drums are less likely to punch through. What are
Yeah.
these sort of trade-offs that you're looking at?
Yeah. And it's always in the low end. It's like the guitars take over the kick or the bass take over the kick. It's always that's why kick has to be number one. And kick always has to be, because that's what's driving the rhythm, and that's what's kind of moving the track forward and having that impact, because guitars and bass don't have that impact. They more have like a drony, like long drony notes more than actual like impact and transients. So that they just kind of have to be like a carpet of low end that the kick kind of punches through. So that's kind of getting the kick to punch through all of that. Guitars and bass is the hardest thing for sure. Yeah.
Fascinating. And moving to the vocals, how does that impact the heavy aesthetic? Because before you were saying about down tuning, which is fascinating, is to have down tuning, you've got to have A440 tuning to have that.
Yeah,
context.
right.
So with vocals, if we've got very, very heavy throat vocals, very aggressive, either death metal or black metal screams, how is heaviness impacted by variation or different contexts with vocals?
Yeah, it's not, for me at least, it's not, I'm not a huge vocal guy, even though I make music that has vocals on it. For me, it's more like, okay, how are we gonna put vocals on this? And trying to weave it in a way that it doesn't disrupt the heaviness. That's more my view of it. Like, I mean, of course, like maybe a heavier part or a breakdown, if you do a scream on top of that, that can come across more heavy. But I personally necessarily don't think so. But I do like, I mean, we are a band, we have a vocalist, and we want to play live and have a vocalist, and that's the reason we put vocals on the music. But like the technical nature of our music and like the dense production, it's not easy to put vocals on top of everything, and it's more like a challenge, like I said, to not make it less heavy. That's more the challenge for me with vocals.
Sure, that's interesting. From watching you do your mix sessions previously, I know you're regularly using saturation and analog emulations. And do you have a typical approach with the mix? You know, we're talking about these different textures, and I know that you'll often use saturation on your kick and your bass and on vocals, and obviously parallel distortion sometimes. But do you have anything that you would consider a typical approach where you go, all right, I want more distortion with the vocals to make it more cohesive with the guitars? Or is there anything you consider typical about your...
But it's like anything with mixing. When you listen to a sound, you hear what you want to do with it. So like this sound might need more high frequencies, and it might need distortion, and it might need compression. It's like anything in mixing. You kind of listen to the sound and judge off of that. But of course, yeah, I since everything needs to fit in this like huge production with all of these loud and full range frequency-wise instruments, if you have to fit something in there, you might have to compress and distort it to make it consistent enough to shine through the other instruments. It's like you kind of decide with any instrument. I kind of decide the frequency response I want as far as like the profile of the sound, and then all I'm doing after that is measures to make sure that that frequency profile is maintained, and that is like slamming it with compression and distortion to maintain that. So you don't have that much dynamics, I suppose. Less dynamics in my mixes, I suppose. But like for a snare, for instance, I want the snare to have this amount of low end, this amount of mids, and this amount of highs, and I want it to stay that way through all the hits. And that's like compression and distortion helps me get that to that point. Yeah.
Interesting with chatted a lot and you've referenced impact and these transients and the impact of the drums and it all hitting together and being super tight. But a lot of your production approaches actually don't exactly go against that, but you often use drum samples that are made from the room mics, and that seems more potentially about sustain and ambience than that transience. Are you looking for different qualities from different drum samples, or?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, some samples are meant to create the sense of space. Like this drum is recorded in a room or a space, and that kind of in the human brain connects to. We're used to hearing a room sound in anything. Like now, when we're talking, we're used to hearing the sound bouncing off of the walls. And if it's just like dry and nothing, you don't get that sense of space. And I feel like in heavy production, you need that sense of the sense of impact, the sense of size, and the sense of space adds to that size perspective. Like you said, the long reverbs. It sounds like you're in space or in a huge room or like a mountain range that's echoing or some stuff. So all that, yeah, it just creates that sense of space that the human mind connects to.
And when you've recorded your drums yourself, do you usually record clean hits from the kit used for tracking?
I mean, I could have done that for sure, and that would probably work. But for me, with a lot of what I record, is like I've already made the song fully with programmed drums, and I'm used to these programmed drums. So I want the real drums to sound as close to that as possible. So I just end up blending in the samples I used for the demo, and to make like the meeting of two worlds. So like the consistency and heaviness of the samples I used in the demo combined with like the organic and like the dynamics I get from the real drum performance, and I just try to combine those.
And then obviously it'll vary from project to project, but when we're talking about these different roles, you've got the punch and the transient attack, and then you've got the more ambience and the more sustain based. Does that get reflected in how many different kick samples and snare samples you'll use?
I feel like the sample, when I use a lot of samples, it usually is not the room sound or whatever. I usually just use one room sound and I'm happy with that. But like if I usually use like multiple, like maybe like 5-6 snare samples to get the impact and the transient the way I want it to sound. So that's like using multiple samples usually has to do more with the impact and the fast, like the transient, to get that to impact in a way that I feel sounds good. The room sound usually just set it and forget it, for me at least, yeah.
And with those different qualities that you're looking at from the different snare samples, do you tend to look at a balance whereby you've got the 4 or 5 collective snare samples and the real acoustic sample, and you're looking for particular balance there as the contribution from each?
Yeah, like the real snare often can be too dynamic, and maybe it's really hard to play and have consistent good snare hits, because a good snare hit is like millimeters. If you're a millimeter off, it can sound way different and bad. But maybe you kept the take because it sounded good when you did it, and then when you listen in the mix, it's like, that snare hit's totally off. So I don't want to hear. I don't want the bad snare hits to be audible. So I blend in the samples enough to where that kind of masks it, and you get that consistency I want, but at the same time you get the dynamics and the different type of hits from the real snare, but you still get that impact. Yeah.
And do you ever paste up the best hits from the acoustic snare?
Sometimes I go through, sometimes I go through and like the really bad ones, I just copy in a good one, yeah, for sure.
Do you ever give an approach with your room samples and then the different samples that you use for different qualities? I mean, how many kick samples would you usually use? Is it?
I mean, it's different, but I feel like I kind of whittled it down to 1 or 2, or 1 more dynamic, real sounding kick sample or kick, and then like a one shot, which is like one perfect, fully mixed, really nice kick drum, and I blend those together to get like the dynamics and the variation from the real one, and the consistency. And usually most of the low end will be a one shot, because that's super consistent, and your ear kind of doesn't recognize the fakeness in low end. So like if the low end is super like robotic, but the high end might be more dynamic and real, then you're still gonna register it as a real drum, or like having enough dynamics to not react to like a super robotic one shot. Yeah.
But you still keep a little bit of the acoustic kick in there, or
Of
tend
course,
to replace?
yeah, of course, yeah.
keep
But I usually want to use the high end of the acoustic kick, because that's where I want that variation of the high end, but I want the consistency of the low end from the one shot. Yeah.
And then, what's your approach, if you have one, of your aux sends to reverbs? So we've got these room sound samples, and I've seen that you'll often send those to reverb as well.
Yeah, it's just to create like a fake drum room, a perfect fake drum room. So like all of the kick close mic and the snare close mic and toms and rooms and blah blah blah, I send those to the reverb, but in a different mix. So I might send more of the room to the reverbs, and all of that combines into a little drum mix of its own, which kind of places the drums in space, in like the same space, instead of having a room sample that's recorded in that studio and that room sample is recorded in that studio, and kind of making everything cohesive. That's kind of why I do that, yeah.
And then you have different feeds to a different reverb from your drum samples?
No, just one reverb, and just sending all of the stuff there, but in a different kind of mix than how it is going out to the master bus, yeah.
Got you. And then, so the snare, will it be the snare acoustic with the samples onto a bus and then send it from the bus, or is it?
Yeah, no, like you said, yeah.
From the bus, okay. So is your involvement as a creative within the metal music industry, obviously with Humanity's Last Breath, you have that vision of the band and songwriting and putting the albums together. How do you see songwriting fitting into Heaviness?
Yeah, it's really important, of course. I mean, combining the production and the low tuning and all of it. If I would make like a Lorna Shore song with that type of production, it's not going to sound very good or very heavy. So I definitely tailor my writing to complement the production. So that's why like all of my songs is like 90 to 100 BPMs, so like super slow to make everything breathe, and to so you can hear all the sense of space and the sense of size. So not and also using like negative space a lot, like silence, to make the impacts super hard. That's extremely important. Like the silence part, especially in my riffs and production, like and kind of tailoring it so that everything gets its place. Maybe there's a riff where the kick kind of comes in by itself, and after the kick hits, the riff and the bass comes in. So like they kind of trade off, and yeah, kind of just trying to make it as effective as possible to the production. Yeah.
Fascinating. Is it okay if we now move on to looking at your mix of the In Solitude project?
Of course.